Recently, a number of original thinkers of our time gave talks and interviews around the current crisis. I found it fascinating that people from different fields are coming to the same conclusions. In this first episode, we will take a look at the thoughts of Yuval Noah Harari, a renowned author, historian, and those of Edward Snowden, a dissident and whistleblower. Harari first lays out the current state of the world and the immediate choices we face.
What is really happening is that history is accelerating, and that processes that usually take years, maybe decades, are now taking just a couple of days. If I look at my own university, they have been talking for 20 years about moving some courses online, and nothing happened. Now, within 1 week, they moved the entire university, all the courses, online in 1 week. And when the crisis is over, it's not like we're going back to the place where we started. And it will be the same in so many different areas, in the economy, in the political system. So again, I can't predict which of all these experiments will succeed and what the outcome will be. The important thing is to make people realize in almost every field, we have choices. It's not predetermined.
One big choice is whether we deal with this crisis through nationalistic isolation, each country competing with all the others for the scarce resources, or whether we deal with it through international solidarity and cooperation, and which this will shape not just the crisis, but also the world for years to come. Similarly, on the level of each individual country, each country has to choose whether it deals with the crisis in an authoritarian way by empowering some dictator or some powerful authority, or whether it deals with the crisis by empowering the citizens and keeping democratic checks and balances. And we see different countries adopting very different approaches, and this will obviously shape these countries for years to come.
On the one hand, this kind of crisis could accelerate processes of democratic collapse and the rise of authoritarian strongmen, people panicking and economic crisis, they feel threatened biologically by an epidemic, and they yearn for some strong leader that can protect them. Or it can go in the exact opposite. People realizing because of this crisis, the importance of having a national solidarity. Over the last few years, what really led to the crisis of democracy is that politicians in many countries intentionally divided society into hostile camps, presenting themselves as the leaders of one camp and presenting the other camp not as legitimate rivals, but as dangerous traitors. And this was their ticket to power. In a normal situation, maybe you can run a country, even like the US, with the support of just half the population. But you can't do it in a crisis like this.
Harari then went on to explain why the slip into authoritarianism is very bad.
First of all, because once you have such a big leader, they will not leave once the crisis is over. They will always find an excuse to hang on to power. There is always a new emergency coming. And once you give up your freedom, it's very difficult to take it back. Secondly, dictatorships are just not more efficient than democracies in an emergency like this. People imagine that the dictatorships are better because they can make decisions faster. And that's true to some extent. They don't have to consult with anybody, just one man making all the decisions. But the problem is that if this one man took a wrong decision, made a mistake, usually he will never admit it. He will just blame others. I made the right decision, but there are traitors and enemies, and because of this, the crisis is only getting worse. So I need even more power. Give me even more power to deal with these traitors and enemies. In a democracy, in contrast, when a government makes the wrong decision, it is more willing to admit a mistake and try something else, because there are different voices, there are more interests involved in making the decision, and therefore in the long run, we see that even in emergencies, democracies often work better than dictatorships. And you see the world today. So yes, China, which is an authoritarian regime, dealt with the situation relatively effectively, but so did South Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand, which are democracies. And according to at least to some measures, these countries actually dealt with the crisis better than China without becoming dictatorships. So we shouldn't, we have all these strongmen just using the emergency, the epidemic as an excuse to gain power, and we shouldn't believe them. We shouldn't fall into this trap. If you could trust them to be these super intelligent and compassionate beings, then maybe we can argue about it. But when you look at most of the governments who are doing surveillance around the world, they are not necessarily the most intelligent or most compassionate. There are many politicians that I don't think they really have the best intention about the population. And we've seen it so many times before in history. Even if they have good intentions, the problem is that humans are prone to mistakes. If you build a political system on the assumption that the government will never make a mistake, then this is a recipe for disaster. And the big problem with dictatorships is, yes, they have some advantages, like you can speed up the process of decision making because you don't have to consult with many people. It's just one person taking all the important decisions. So obviously it's faster. But the problem is, if that person makes a mistake and he or she are bound to make a mistake sooner or later, they are never willing to admit their mistake and try something else. They usually just blame it on enemies or traitors and demand even more power to fight these enemies and traitors. And they're just doubling down on their mistake. In contrast, in a democracy, usually the government is more willing to admit mistakes, or you can replace the government. The voters can admit, oh, we made a mistake choosing this guy, next time we'll choose somebody else. And because there are more voices in the system, then there are more causes of action, and it's easier to say, okay, we tried this, it didn't work, let's try something else. And you don't need to just invent enemies and traitors in order to blame them for all the problems. You can just say, yes, we made a mistake. Previous policy wasn't the best, let's try something else. And this willingness to admit mistake and try something else, this is the real key to human progress in almost every field.
Snowden echoed Harari's point. In fact, he made a comparison about China's handling of the crisis versus South Korea's.
There are arguments being made that China can do things that the United States can't. Now, that doesn't mean that what these autocratic countries are doing is actually more effective. There are really only two things that we know to be true. One is that no one knows the true number of infected, because we can only, in the absolute best case, know the confirmed cases of people that we've actually tested. And once you start to layer in this authoritarian type of policy structure, instead of policy being guided by science and facts, you begin to see things like information releases becoming political decisions. Now, this is not new. In fact, the Spanish flu around 1918 did not actually originate in Spain. It was actually spreading in World War I through the trenches, where everybody was in terrible conditions. But the militaries of the day had imposed restrictions on what the press could report that could impact the war effort. And so Spain, being a neutral country, was publishing what they were actually seeing in their country. And so we just presumed, because they were the only ones that were telling the truth, that it came from them. Now, we're a little further ahead than that today, but that doesn't erase the fact that people in power who see that there is a political advantage to disguising or concealing or massaging or denying numbers may choose to lie about it. It's happened before, and it's almost certainly happening now. Well, what if South Korea took a Chinese example here? Would they have been more effective in halting the spread of the virus if they had just welded people into their homes, right? If they had chained people's doors, turned off the elevators, blocked the stairways, set up cameras outside the homes, said people can't leave without a special pass from the government. All of these things. It's not clear that would have been more effective. And in fact, I think there's a very strong argument It is very possible that the response to the pandemic and the manner in which it was taken in China caused more harm than what would have happened in a South Korean-style response. We have direct documented cases where they chained the doors to people's house, they wouldn't allow them to go home from the hospital, and they had dependents at home, children with disabilities and things like that, who literally starved to death in the absence of their caretakers.
On that sobering note, our first episode is concluded. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. We'll release more content like this in the future. Thanks, and see you next time.